The morning of the auction, there were 19 sheep nobody wanted. They were the tail end of the season, late lambs born to tired ewes, and they looked it. They stood huddled in a splintery holding pen set off to the side, a place reserved for animals that were a problem, a question mark, or a charity case. Their wool was thin and clotted with the mud of a wet spring. Their ribs showed like the hoops on a forgotten barrel, and their eyes held the dull, watery look of things that have given up on expecting much from the world. The other pens were full of noise and vigor, of thick-wooled ewes and burly rams that commanded the attention of the men in dusty boots and worn gimme caps. Those men who had known land and livestock their whole lives, walked right past the pen of 19 without a second glance. The auctioneer, a man whose voice could chip stone, didn't even bother to give them a proper introduction, just waved a dismissive hand in their direction and called them the cleanup lot, a term that meant they were one step from being rendered. They were, in the collective and unspoken judgment of the county, not worth the trouble, not worth the feed, not worth the medicine, not worth the space they occupied. Into this theater of practical judgment walked Alara Vance. She was not a stranger to this place, but she might as well have been. She had grown up in the shadow of these hills, but 10 years in a city had scrubbed the local rhythm from her walk and replaced the easy familiarity in her eyes with a quiet, guarded watchfulness. She had come home not in triumph, but in retreat, carrying the weight of a quiet failure that had no dramatic story, only the slow, grinding erosion of a life that did not fit. She had inherited her grandfather's farm, a place the county now referred to as the Old Vance Place, a name that consigned it to memory rather than to the present. She had no plan, only a small saving that felt more like a handful of seed than a proper harvest, and the heavy deed to a place that felt more like a burden than a gift. She walked past the pens of prize animals, ignoring the confident bleating and the thick, healthy scent of lanolin and hay. She went directly to the back pen, to the 19 sheep that were the auction's afterthought, and there she stood, for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable, just watching. She did not prod them or check their teeth. She just watched, her gaze moving from one to the next, her posture still and patient, as if she were not judging livestock, but reading a long and complicated letter. The men noticed. They always noticed something out of place, and a young woman, alone, studying the refuse of the auction, was as out of place as a flower growing through a crack in the concrete floor. Whispers followed her, like burrs sticking to a wool coat. Then came the soft chuckles, the nudges. When the auctioneer finally grudgingly called for bids on the cleanup lot, the silence was thick with amusement. He started the bidding at a price that was an insult, a token sum meant to get them off the books. No one moved. The auctioneer sighed, ready to declare them a loss. And then a single number, held up on a flimsy piece of cardboard, rose from the spot where the woman was standing. Alara Vance bought the entire lot, 19 heads of what the crowd considered to be future dog food, for a price that was still less than a single one of the prize ewes in the front pen. The laughter was no longer quiet. It was open, rolling, a wave of masculine certainty and shared derision. It washed over her, but she did not seem to notice, her face as calm and unreadable as a still pond. She simply lowered her number, walked to the clerk's window to settle her bill, and began to arrange for a hauler. Jedediah Thorne, a man whose own farm was a sprawling, immaculate showcase of modern efficiency and heavy debt, was the loudest of them all. His land was a testament to force, of potent fertilizers that pushed the soil harder than it wanted to go, and of loans that mortgaged the future for the sake of the present. He was successful, respected, and his opinion carried the weight of his many acres. He strode over to a group of his peers, his own laughter booming over the others. He jerked a thumb in Alara's direction, a wide, pitying smirk on his face. "Well, boy," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Looks like the Old Vance place just bought itself 19 funerals. She'll be lucky if half of them live to see the first frost." The men around him nodded, their faces reflecting his own certainty. It was not just a joke. It was a statement of fact, a law of their world. You couldn't make something from nothing. You couldn't spin gold from dross. A weak animal was a weak animal, and sentiment was the most expensive luxury a farmer could afford. He had meant it as a prediction of failure, a casual dismissal of a fool, and her money soon parted. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. It was the first stone cast in what would become a quiet landslide, the first note in a song the whole county would eventually learn by heart. But on that day, in the dust and noise of the auction yard, it was just the sound of a world that thought it knew everything, laughing at a woman who was willing to bet that it did not. She heard him, of course. Everyone heard him, but she did not turn, did not offer a reply. She just signed the final paper, her hands steady, and then went to wait for the truck that would carry her flock of lost causes home. The laughter was the price of admission, and she had already decided she was willing to pay it. Her return to the valley had been a quiet affair, a slow retreat from a life built on pavement and borrowed light. The city had promised opportunity, but for Ilara, it had delivered a profound and deepening sense of misplacement. It was not a single, spectacular failure, but 1,000 tiny concessions, a slow fraying of the soul, like a rope that wears thin in one unseen spot until it can no longer hold weight. She had worked a series of jobs that required her to be someone else, to smile when she did not feel it, to sell things she did not believe in. The noise, the hurry, the relentless focus on the next thing, the new thing, had hollowed her out. When the call came that her grandfather, Silas, had passed and the farm was now hers, it felt less like an inheritance and more like an anchor tossed to a drowning woman. She packed her few belongings, settled her affairs with the same quiet efficiency she did everything else, and drove back toward the green rolling hills of her childhood, feeling unmoored, with no map for the future and only the ghost of a past she barely remembered. The farm she returned to was a portrait of gentle decay. It was not ruined, but sleeping, and its dreams were of a time long past. The white paint on the two-story house was peeling in long, curling strips, like sunburnt skin. The porch sagged in the middle, a weary sigh held for a decade. The barn, a great gray structure built by her great-grandfather, leaned just enough to the east that it seemed to be listening to the wind. The pastures, once meticulously managed, were overgrown with thistle and bramble, the fences a lacework of rusted wire and fallen posts. To the rest of the county, it was a liability, a piece of land losing a slow battle with nature. The real estate agent who had called her, a man with a voice as smooth and artificial as a plastic countertop, had spoken of its potential for subdivision, of the money tied up in the acreage. He saw lots, not land. He saw a problem to be liquidated. And for the first few weeks, that was all Ilara saw too. A burden, a complicated grief tied to acres of work she did not know how to begin. But then something shifted. Instead of busying herself with plans to sell, she began to walk. Every morning with the mist still clinging to the low places in the fields, and every evening as the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows from the old oaks, she would walk the property lines. She carried no tools, no agenda. She simply walked and looked and listened. She learned the way the water pooled near the creek after a rain, the places where the deer had worn paths through the tall grass, the particular slant of light that fell across the south-facing slope in the late afternoon. She put her hand on the warm, weathered wood of the barn, feeling the deep-grained memory of the seasons it had endured. She sat on the sagging porch and watched the slow, unhurried passage of the clouds. Instead of feeling the frantic need to do something, to fix, to conquer, she felt something inside her begin to settle. The frantic, buzzing energy of the city finally drained away, leaving behind a quiet stillness she hadn't realized she had lost. The land was not a problem to be solved. It was a story to be read. And in that quiet revelation, she decided without ceremony or announcement that she would not sell. She would stay. She would try to understand the forgotten language of this place that was, against all logic, her own. The key was in the attic. In a dusty, forgotten corner, tucked beneath a pile of old quilts that smelled of cedar and thyme, was a heavy sea chest. It had belonged to her grandfather, Silas Vance. Inside, beneath his folded service uniform and a box of tin-type photographs of stern-faced ancestors, were the notebooks. There were dozens of them, simple black-covered ledgers of the kind a shopkeeper might use, but their contents were anything but simple. They were not just farm logs. They were the life's work of a philosopher whose subject was 150 acres of dirt, grass, and water. For nearly 50 years, Silas had recorded everything, not just planting dates and calving records, but the subtle shifts in the wind before a storm, the specific shade of green in the pasture after a long drought, the way the cattle would stand differently on a day when the air was heavy. His handwriting was a small, neat, backward-sloping script, and the pages were filled with observations that read like the field notes of a man studying something he loved. He drew maps of the pastures, not with straight lines, but with contours that followed the land's natural inclination, marking areas he called the deep soils, the thirsty slope, the winter shelter. As Ilara spent her evenings under the light of a single bare bulb, turning the fragile yellowed pages, a central idea began to emerge. It was a philosophy woven through 50 years of patient observation. Silas had underlined certain phrases again and again, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. The ground remembers. Let the land do the work. Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do. He wrote about the health of the animal being a direct reflection of the health of the soil it stood upon, not just the feed it was given. He believed that the land, if rested and respected, would provide its own medicine, its own resilience. He wrote about the folly of pushing for maximum yield, arguing that it was like shouting at a plant to grow faster. It only created a brittle, shallow strength. His methods were all about observation, patience, and a deep, holistic understanding of the intricate web of relationships between soil, water, plants, and animals. He was not a brute force commander of his farm, like Jed Thorne. He was its quiet, attentive partner. He had seen the land not as a factory for producing commodities, but as a living entity with a memory and a wisdom of its own. There was one recurring note that puzzled her. Tucked into the margins of entries about buying new stock, he would write, "Those are the ones." He wrote it next to descriptions of animals that sounded, by all modern standards, undesirable. Bought the heifer that hung back from the trough. Picked the 3 ewes the dogs couldn't easily bunch. He seemed to value a certain kind of stubborn, self-sufficient resilience over the plump, docile conformity that one prizes at the county fair. It was a clue, but she didn't fully understand it. The answer, or at least the final piece of it, lay with the only living person who might remember Silas's ways, her great-aunt Maeve. Maeve was in her 90s, living in a small, tidy house at the edge of town. She was as terse and practical as the worn pair of men's work boots she still favored. Ilara went to her, not with a grand explanation, but with a simple question. She brought one of the notebooks with her. Maeve took it, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle on the old paper. She didn't read it, but just held it for a moment, as if weighing the memories inside. Ilara explained her purchase at the auction, the 19 sheep, the laughter. Maeve just nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on something far away. "Your grandfather was laughed at, too," she said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "They said he farmed with his eyes instead of his wallet." She pointed a single bony finger at the notebook. "That's all in there, everything you need, but you have to learn to read it." Then as Ilara was about to leave, Maeve added the final, crucial piece, the key that unlocked the puzzle of "those are the ones." Silas always said to buy the ones that stood in the middle of the pen when the rest were pressed against the fence, the ones that kept their own space, said they knew something the others didn't. In that one cryptic sentence, Ilara understood. He wasn't buying weakness, he was buying a different kind of strength, the strength of the survivor. The work began the next day, and it was slow, quiet, and almost entirely invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. It was not the dramatic work of plows turning over vast tracts of earth or huge combines harvesting fields of corn. It was the unglamorous, patient labor of restoration. Using the hand-drawn maps from Silas's notebooks, Ilara began mending fences. She didn't bulldoze new lines but followed the old, forgotten ones, the ones that curved with the contours of the land. She divided the overgrown pastures into smaller paddocks, just as he had described. The work was hard on her hands, which were still soft from her city life. She spent her days stretching wire, digging post holes with an old-fashioned auger, and clearing brambles with a scythe, its rhythmic whisper the only sound besides the wind. She brought the 19 sheep not to the richest pasture, but to one of the poorest, a patch of land thick with weeds and tough native grasses. The notebooks had been clear. Start them on the hard stuff. It teaches their bodies what to do. The good pasture is a reward, not a right. She began a system of rotational grazing, moving the small flock every few days from one small paddock to the next. The goal was not to fatten them quickly, but to have them graze the tops of the plants, stimulating growth, while their hooves broke up the soil and their manure revitalized it. The land was healing the sheep, and the sheep were healing the land. It was a slow, symbiotic dance. She kept her own notebook now, mimicking her grandfather's, recording the minute changes, the way the sheep spread out, the first signs of new clover emerging where they had grazed. The work was solitary and all-consuming, a conversation between her, the land, and the ghost of her grandfather. The county's true circulatory system was not its network of roads, but the gossip that flowed through its community hubs. The primary artery was Pratt's Feed and Seed, a place that smelled of molasses, dust, and oiled leather. It was here that news was made, reputations were forged, and judgments were handed down. Jedediah Thorne and his circle held court there most Saturday mornings, leaning against sacks of feed, their coffee cups in hand, and their favorite topic of conversation, delivered with a tone of false neighborly concern, was Alara Vance. "Saw your flock out on that old thistle patch, Alara," Thorne would say, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "You feeding 'em rocks and good intentions?" His friends would chuckle into their chests. Another time it was, "Heard any lambs bleeding yet? Or are they too busy writing their wills?" They treated her project as a running joke, a bit of local color. They asked about her pet sheep and her botany experiment with a patronizing friendliness that was sharper than open hostility. The mockery was a constant, low-grade fever, a reminder of her status as an outsider pursuing a foolish, sentimental dream. Ilara's response to this was a quiet and unnerving form of disarmament. She would meet their smirking questions with a level, direct gaze and a plain, unadorned answer. When Thorne asked if she was feeding them rocks, she simply replied, "They seem to be finding what they need." When asked about the lambs, she said, "The time for that isn't here yet." She offered no defense, no argument, no flicker of anger or embarrassment. Her tone was flat, factual, and free of any need for their approval. This, more than anything, seemed to confuse them. They were expecting a fight, or at least a flustered defense they could pick apart. Instead, her quiet confidence was like a wall of fog. Their taunts went into it and simply vanished. It took the fun out of the question, leaving them in a brief, awkward silence before one of them would change the subject. She would finish her business, buying a small bag of minerals or a spool of wire, nod politely to the proprietor, and leave. Her refusal to be provoked was, in its own way, a position of strength. She was not playing their game, and it drove them to distraction. Not everyone participated in the mockery. The proprietor of the store, Elias Pratt, was a man who had seen generations of farmers come and go. He was as old and weathered as the wooden scoop he used for grain, and he said very little. But he watched everything. He saw the condescending smiles of Thorne's crew, and he saw the quiet, unshakable calm with which Alara met them. He had known her grandfather, Silas. He remembered the man and the quiet murmurs that had followed him too. One Saturday, after Thorne and his friends had left, and Alara was paying for a new pair of work gloves, Elias leaned forward over the counter. His voice was a low rumble. "Don't you pay them any mind," he said, not looking at her but at the worn cash register keys. "Your grandfather had the best lamb in this county, best tasting anyway. Said it was because his sheep ate the place they lived, all the herbs and the weeds, not just corn from a bag." He pushed her change into her hand. He was laughed at too, right up until the day he sold his stock for twice what anyone else was getting, because a fancy chef from the city tasted it once and never bought from anyone else again. It was the first piece of external validation she had received. It was not praise but a simple statement of historical fact, and it felt more valuable than any prize ribbon. It was confirmation that the path she was on was not a new one. but an old, forgotten road that had once led somewhere true. She nodded, a small, grateful smile touching her lips for the first time in that store. "Thank you, Elias," she said. And the old man just grunted, a sound of profound and complete understanding. The first tangible success was not a dramatic event, but a series of quiet affirmations. It began with the wool. As the sheep moved across the paddocks, their diet diversifying with every rotation, their coats began to change. The thin, matted fleece was shed, and what grew in its place was thicker, richer, with a deep luster and a surprising crimp. It felt springy and alive to the touch and carried the faint, clean scent of wild thyme and clover. Then came the lambs. They were born in the late spring, not in a sheltered barn, but out in the pasture, on a bed of thick, recovering grass. The ewes, the same ones that had looked half dead at the auction, proved to be excellent mothers. They were attentive and fiercely protective. The lambs were not large, but they were vigorous, up on their feet within minutes, possessed of the same hardy, self-sufficient spirit as their mothers. Ilara would watch them from a distance, making notes in her ledger, a deep, quiet satisfaction settling in her. She recorded the births without ceremony, just as her grandfather would have, but she allowed herself to sit on the porch that evening, long after the sun had set, and just feel the rightness of it. The land was coming back to life, and it was breathing that life into the animals. The 19 funerals Jed Thorne had predicted had turned into a flock of nearly 40 thriving lives. The first sales happened almost by accident. Elias Pratt, remembering the taste of Silas Vance's lamb from his youth, asked if he could buy one for his own family's Sunday dinner. He was blunt about it. "I want to see if the memory is true," and he'd said. Ilara agreed. The process was simple and local. When Elias came back to the feed store the following week, he didn't say a word to Ilara. He just sought out Jed Thorne. He waited until Thorne was holding forth on the price of commodity corn, and then he interrupted, something he never did. "Jed," he said, his voice quiet but caring, "I ate one of the Vance lambs last night." Thorne looked at him, annoyed at the interruption. "And?" he asked, expecting a story of stringy, worthless meat. Elias paused, letting the silence build. "It was the best piece of meat I've had in 30 years, he said simply. "Tasted of the hills. Tasted clean." He then turned and walked away, leaving Thorne standing in a sudden, profound silence. Word of mouth, in a small community, travels faster than fire in a dry field. A few other older residents, people who remembered Silas's reputation, came calling. A local butcher, a curious man named Henderson, asked to see the flock. He was impressed not by their size but by their condition. "They're built different," he said, a phrase that stuck. He bought two, and a week later, he called her and placed a standing order. He didn't have a name for the product on his labels at first, but his customers started asking for that burnt fork lamb, naming it after the creek that ran through her property. Without any intentional branding, without a single dollar spent on marketing, her farm had a name and a reputation, built on the undeniable quality of the product itself. Then came the drought. It didn't arrive suddenly, but crept in, a slow, merciless thief. The spring rains were light and scattered, and then they stopped altogether. Summer arrived with a brassy, unforgiving sun and a hot, dry wind that seemed to suck the very moisture from the air. Day after day, the sky remained a vast, empty bowl of blue. The creeks and ponds in the county shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. The lush, green fields of corn and soy that men like Jed Thorne cultivated with a cocktail of fertilizers and irrigation began to suffer. The corn stalks, which should have been towering and green, were stunted and yellow, their leaves curling inward, as if in prayer for a rain that never came. The pastures turned a uniform, dusty brown. The land itself looked tired, beaten into submission. Farmers who had taken out massive loans to finance their operations, who were counting on a bumper crop to service their debt, began to panic. The price of hay skyrocketed as everyone scrambled to buy feed for their starving herds. The auction yard, once a place of hopeful investment, became a site of desperate liquidation. Men who had laughed at Ilara's 19 scrawny sheep were now trucking in their own prize-winning herds, selling them off for a fraction of their value just to cut their losses. The whole county was gripped by a quiet, desperate fear. The modern, forceful way of farming, so impressive in good years, was proving to be a house of cards in a strong wind. In the midst of this brown, desiccated landscape, the old Vance place became an anomaly, a miracle, an impossibility. From the county road that ran past her property, you could see it clearly. Her pastures were green. Not the lurid, artificial green of a golf course, but a deep, resilient, living green. The rotational grazing system had created a thick mat of roots that held moisture deep in the soil. The native grasses and deep-rooted herbs her grandfather had written about, the ones other farmers considered weeds, were drought-resistant, their roots tapping into water sources the shallow-rooted commercial grasses couldn't reach. Her sheep, accustomed to a diverse and challenging diet, thrived. They grazed on the tough living plants, their health unshaken. The land, which had been allowed to rest and recover, was now repaying that kindness. Its memory was long, and it remembered how to survive. People began to drive out to her farm, parking on the shoulder of the road just to look. They would stand there in silence, staring at the green island in a brown county. It was a sight that defied everything they thought they knew. Jed Thorne's fields were dust. His prize cattle were gone, sold at a catastrophic loss. Elara Vance's fields were alive, and her flock of funerals was grazing peacefully under the same brutal sun that had destroyed everyone else. The laughter from the auction house had been replaced by a stunned, bewildered silence. There was no need for argument, no need for explanation. The proof was there, written in the stark, undeniable language of the land itself. The vindication was quiet, absolute, and green. The visit came on a Tuesday afternoon, in the hottest, driest part of the week. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of a familiar pickup truck long before it pulled into her lane. It was Jedediah Thorne. He didn't drive up to the house, but parked by the gate, the engine cutting out with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. He got out of the truck and just stood there for a long moment, looking. He looked at the green pasture, at the healthy, placid sheep, and then at the old, unpainted barn that was still standing strong. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over, a gesture of uncertainty she had never seen from him. Elara had been in the barn, mending a leather strap on a harness she'd found, and she walked out into the blinding sunlight to meet him. She didn't say anything, just waited. He walked slowly toward her, his boots scuffing in the dry dirt of her driveway. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze not quite meeting hers. He looked past her, at the thriving land that was a direct refutation of his entire life's philosophy. Finally he spoke. His voice, usually so full of bluster and certainty, was quiet, stripped of all its usual confidence. "I was wrong," he said. He said it plainly, not as an apology or as praise, but as a kind of grievance against the order of things, an admission that the world did not work the way he had insisted it must. It was the hardest sentence he had ever spoken, and it hung in the hot, dry air between them, heavy as stone. Elara just nodded, accepting the statement as the fact it was. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not smile. To do so would have been to reduce this moment to a petty victory, and it was something much larger than that. It was the surrender of an entire worldview. Thorne finally looked at her, his eyes full of a weary, baffled respect. "How?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it contained everything. The drought, his ruined fields, her impossible success. He was not just asking about the sheep or the grass. He was asking about the fundamental principle that he had missed. Instead of answering with words, Elara gestured for him to follow her. She walked him to the edge of the nearest pasture, the one closest to the road. She knelt down and he, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. She pushed aside the thick blades of grass and herbs and dug her fingers into the soil. It was dark, crumbly, and cool to the touch, alive with the smell of earth and decay and life. "Your grandfather," Thorne began, then trailed off. "He knew," Elara finished for him, her voice soft. "He listened to the land. I'm just trying to do the same." Thorne looked from the soil in her hands to his own cracked, pale fields visible in the distance. The contrast was absolute. He was a man who had lost an argument with reality. "Will you teach me?" he asked, the words coming out in a rush, as if he were afraid they would get stuck. It was not just a request for farming tips. It was the plea of a man asking for a new map, having finally admitted he was lost. Jed Thorne's conversion did what Ilara's success alone could not. It cracked the foundation of the county's conventional wisdom. When a man like Thorne, a pillar of the old way, publicly admits his error and seeks to learn from the very person he mocked, others are forced to reconsider their own certainties. The news of his visit to her farm, of his quiet request to be taught, spread just as quickly as the jokes once had, but with a different, more somber tone. It gave other farmers, men who were also watching their livelihoods turn to dust, the permission to be curious, the permission to be wrong. The trickle of visitors to the old Vance place became a steady stream. They came not with smirks, but with questions. They were men in their 50s and 60s, their faces etched with the worry of a lifetime on the land, who had farmed the same way their fathers had, only with bigger machines and more powerful chemicals. They would stand with Ilara in her fields, their hands in their pockets, and listen. She became an unlikely teacher. She didn't lecture, she showed. She walked them through her rotational grazing system, explaining how moving the animals prevented overgrazing and allowed the land to rest. She would get down on her knees and show them the complex life in her soil, the worms and the mycelial networks, explaining that this was the real engine of the farm. She shared pages from her grandfather's notebooks, the elegant script and patient wisdom, a revelation to men accustomed to glossy pamphlets from chemical companies. She shared her knowledge freely, without an ounce of gloating, understanding that their shared survival depended on a healthier relationship with the land they all shared. One afternoon, a boy showed up. He couldn't have been more than 16, with a serious face and quiet, watchful eyes. His name was Caleb, and he was the son of one of the farmers who had recently started visiting. He didn't say much, just stood at the edge of the driveway, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Heard you might need some help," he mumbled, looking at the ground. "Fencing and such." Ilara studied him for a moment. He had the same look of quiet self-possession she had seen in her best sheep. She needed help, it was true. The work was expanding, and her own two hands were no longer enough. She agreed to pay him a fair wage. Caleb turned out to be a natural. He was quiet, but he was a ferocious worker, and more importantly, he was an observer. He didn't just do the work, he understood it. He seemed to have an intuitive feel for the land and the animals, what Silas Vance would have called the hands for it. He learned the rhythms of the rotation, anticipated where a fence might need mending, and noticed the subtle signs of an ewe about to lamb before Ilara did. He would spend his breaks not on his phone, but sitting and watching the flock, or studying the pages of Silas's notebooks that Ilara left out on the kitchen table. He rarely asked questions, but when he did, they were insightful, showing he was thinking several steps ahead. In this serious, quiet teenager, Ilara saw the future of her work. He was not just an employee, he was an apprentice, the first link in a chain of knowledge being passed to a new generation. The legacy was no longer just a ghost in a notebook. It was a living, breathing thing, taking root in the heart of a young man who would carry it forward. The sudden demand for her lamb and for her breeding stock could have been a temptation. Farmers from 2 counties over were calling, offering premium prices. A restaurant group from the city wanted to sign an exclusive contract that would have required her to triple her flock in a year. It was the kind of success that would have led most people, especially someone who had started with so little, to take on debt, to expand rapidly, to seize the opportunity with both hands. But Ilara's guiding philosophy now came directly from her grandfather's notebooks. "Grow the way a tree grows," Silas had written, "not by stretching for the sun, but by deepening its roots. Let demand pull you forward. Never let ambition push you over a cliff." She politely turned down the large contracts. She sold her surplus lambs at the price she and Henderson the butcher had agreed upon, and no more. She sold a few of her best ewes and a young ram to Jed Thorne, and a few more to another neighbor who was serious about changing his ways, but she refused to sell off the core of her flock. She would grow, but she would grow the way the land could grow, patiently, organically, without the corrosive influence of debt. Her business philosophy was the same as her farming philosophy. It was about resilience, not speed, about health, not size. This financial prudence, this refusal to be rushed, was perhaps the most radical thing she did, and it cemented her reputation not just as a good farmer, but as a wise one. Aunt Maeve lived long enough to see it all. She lived to see the stream of dusty pickup trucks turning down Alara's lane, to see Jed Thorne, hat in hand, listening intently as her grandniece explained the importance of clover. She lived to see the butcher's shop in town with a permanent sign in the window that read, "Burnt Fork Lamb." One evening in the late autumn after the drought had broken, Alara went to visit her. She brought a jar of honey from the wild hives that had established themselves in her recovering pastures. Maeve was sitting in her usual chair, a blanket over her lap, looking out the window. She seemed smaller, more fragile, as if the years were finally gathering their due. Alara sat with her, and for a long time, they didn't speak. Then Maeve turned her head. Her eyes, though clouded with age, were as sharp as ever. Silas would be proud, she said. It was the highest praise she could give, a declaration that the circle was complete. He always said the land keeps its promises. A week later, Maeve passed away in her sleep, a peaceful end to a long and watchful life. Her death was not a tragedy, but a transition. It marked the final, quiet transfer of a title. With Maeve gone, and with the whole county now looking to her for answers, Alara Vance, the quiet outsider, had become the new wise elder, the carrier of the legacy. The story ends, as so many stories do, where it began. But everything had changed. It was a spring morning at the county livestock auction, 2 years after her first visit. Alara was there again, but this time she walked with a quiet confidence that turned heads for a different reason. She was not there for the cleanup lot. She was there to inspect a prize-winning ram from a well-known breeder, considering him for her own expanding flock. As she moved past the pens, the men, many of whom had been in the crowd that had laughed at her, now nodded to her with a deep, sober respect. Jed Thorne was there, standing beside a pen of his own sheep. They were smaller than the ones he used to raise, but they were hardy, bright-eyed, and healthy. He was explaining to another farmer, in a quiet, measured voice, the principles of rotational grazing. He caught Alara's eye and gave her a slow, grateful nod. The auctioneer, the same man with the voice like chipped stone, spotted her near the main ring. "Mr. Vance," he called out, a slip of the tongue born of deep respect, correcting himself immediately. "Miss Vance, good to see you. We'll be starting with the rams in 5 minutes if you're ready." He was speaking to her, consulting her, as if her presence was the official start of the proceedings. No one laughed, no one smirked. They understood now. They understood the value of what she had seen on that first day, the hidden strength in the thing that had been rejected. The whole world could be in that pen of 19 sheep. And so the lesson settled over the valley, as soft and persistent as a winter snow, changing the landscape of what was known. That the rejected thing is often the most valuable thing if you only have the eyes to see it and the patience to understand it. That a quiet question is more powerful than a loud command. That the ground remembers every kindness and every cruelty and repays both in due time. That patience beats money and attention beats force. That debt is a cage built out of future anxieties, and freedom is a pasture that has been allowed to rest. And most of all, that true worth does not need to argue or shout or boast, because in the end, in the fullness of time, against all laughter and doubt, it simply proves itself.